God says, "I will never talk to you if you skip this now. A big tragedy is coming. Don't skip this." What if the next 24 hours of your life carry more weight than you've been giving them credit for, not because something dramatic is about to happen to you, but because of what you're actually about to do with them? What if the difference between the person you'll be a year from now and the person you currently are comes down to a handful of small, ordinary choices sitting inside this exact single day? I want you to actually stay for this, because I'm not asking you to brace for something frightening. I'm asking you to pay attention to something genuinely within your control, starting right now. You've probably let days slip past you before without much thought, treating them as interchangeable, assuming today doesn't matter as much as some future day still waiting to arrive. And in that assumption, you've probably postponed conversations, decisions, and changes that quietly kept waiting for a more convenient moment that never actually came. The truth is, you've likely had dozens of these exact 24-hour windows already pass you by without ever fully using them. Have you been treating your days as interchangeable, postponing important decisions for a more convenient day that never actually arrives? Why one ordinary day can quietly become a turning point. Here's something worth understanding. Clearly, most turning points in a person's life don't announce themselves as dramatic, obviously significant moments. They look like an ordinary Tuesday, indistinguishable from any other day, except for one specific decision made inside it that ends up reshaping everything that follows. You rarely know in advance which day will turn out to be that one. That's exactly why every day deserves more genuine attention than you've probably been giving it. Can you think of a specific ordinary day in your past that later revealed itself to be a genuine turning point, even though it didn't feel significant at the time? Why waiting for motivation before acting has been costing you more than you realize? Here's something worth being honest about. You've probably been waiting to feel motivated, ready, or fully confident before finally taking the specific action you already know you need to take. That waiting has quietly cost you more time than you've fully calculated, because motivation rarely arrives before action. It usually arrives because of it, built through the simple experience of having already started, regardless of how unready you felt beforehand. Have you been waiting to feel motivated before acting, when readiness might actually only develop after you've already begun? Why the next 24 hours are enough time for one genuine, meaningful step. Here's something worth understanding. Clearly, you don't need to transform your entire life within this single day. You simply need one genuine, meaningful step, the difficult conversation finally scheduled, the habit finally interrupted, the decision finally made instead of endlessly deliberated. One real step taken today builds momentum that an entire week of only thinking about it never actually produces. What is the one genuine, meaningful step you could actually take within the next 24 hours, rather than continuing to only think about it? If this is landing somewhere real in you, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because part 2 goes even deeper into exactly how to make sure this step actually happens. Why you don't need to see the entire path to take this one step today. Here's something worth releasing right now: the pressure to have your entire future completely mapped out before you're willing to take today's specific step forward. You don't need to know exactly where this leads. You simply need enough clarity to take the next responsible action available to you right now, trusting that the rest of the path becomes visible only after you've actually started moving. Are you waiting to see the entire path clearly before taking today's step, when you might only need enough clarity for this one immediate action? Why the people who actually change their lives are the ones who stopped waiting for the perfect day. Here's something worth understanding about the pattern shared by people who genuinely transform their circumstances over time. They rarely waited for a perfect, obviously significant day to finally begin. They simply stopped waiting took real action inside an ordinary day exactly like this one, and let that single decision become the first domino in a much longer sequence of change. The perfect day was never actually required. It was simply an excuse that felt reasonable enough to keep believing. Have you been waiting for a perfect, obviously significant day to finally begin, when ordinary days have always been enough for genuine change to start? Why small action today matters more than a big plan for someday. Here's something worth understanding clearly. An elaborate, comprehensive plan you intend to execute someday holds far less actual power than one small, imperfect action taken today. Plans that never leave the planning stage accomplish nothing. A single genuine step, however small, however imperfect, actually moves your life forward in a way that endless preparation never manages to achieve on its own. Do you have an elaborate plan you've been developing for someday, while avoiding the one small, imperfect action actually available to you today? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because part 2 continues exploring exactly how to build lasting momentum from today's single step. Why what you do today becomes something tomorrow's version of you will be grateful for. Here's something worth considering with real gratitude in advance. Imagine yourself 1 year from today, looking back at this exact day. What would that future version of you want you to actually do right now with these next 24 hours? That future gratitude, imagined honestly, often reveals with striking clarity exactly what today's genuine action should actually be. If you imagined your future self looking back at today with gratitude, what specific action would they want you to take right now? Truth for today. The next 24 hours don't require a perfect plan, complete motivation, or a fully visible path forward. They simply require one genuine, meaningful action, taken today, that your future self will look back on with real gratitude. Ordinary days like this one have always been where genuine transformation actually begins, long before anyone ever recognized their significance in the moment. If you committed right now to taking one genuine step within the next 24 hours, what do you believe that single action would actually be? You've probably let ordinary days slip past you before, waiting for motivation, waiting for a perfect moment, waiting for clarity about the entire path before taking even the first step. Today, you're being asked to simply take one genuine, meaningful action right now, inside these next 24 hours. This is only part 1. Part 2 goes deeper into exactly how to build lasting momentum from this single step forward. If this message reached something real in you today, don't let it end here. Subscribe now, because part 2 continues exactly where this left off. The next 24 hours matter. Now go use them well. God says, "I will never talk to you if you skip this now. A big tragedy is coming. Don't skip this." In part 1, we talked about why ordinary days quietly become turning points, and why one genuine small action today matters more than an elaborate plan for someday. So today, let's go further. Once you've taken that first step, how do you actually build lasting momentum from it, rather than watching today's motivation fade back into old patterns by tomorrow afternoon? Are you ready to learn how to make this actually stick? Here's what tends to happen even after someone takes a genuine, meaningful first step. The initial energy of that decision starts to fade within hours, and by the next day, old routines quietly reassert themselves, pulling attention back toward comfortable habits rather than the momentum you were hoping to sustain. That fade isn't failure. It's simply how human motivation naturally works, unless something intentional is built to carry it forward. Have you taken a genuine first step before, only to watch that initial energy fade back into old patterns within a day or two? Why the second action matters even more than the first one. Here's something worth understanding. Clearly, the first step you took yesterday proved that action was possible. The second step taken today proves that action wasn't a one-time exception, but the actual beginning of a genuine pattern. That second step is often harder to take than people expect, precisely because the initial excitement has already faded, leaving only genuine commitment to carry you forward. What is your second immediate step? And are you prepared to take it today, even without yesterday's initial excitement carrying you forward? Why writing down your specific commitment makes it harder to quietly abandon. Here's something practical worth doing right now. If you haven't already, write down specifically exactly what you committed to yesterday and exactly what today's next step actually looks like. That physical record transforms an abstract intention into something concrete you can return to, something significantly harder to quietly abandon than a feeling you simply remember having once. Have you written down your specific commitment, or is it still just an unrecorded feeling that's easy to quietly let fade? Why telling someone else creates accountability that willpower alone often can't sustain. Here's something worth doing intentionally. Tell at least one trusted person exactly what you've committed to and ask them directly to check in with you in a few days. That accountability, built deliberately rather than left to chance, dramatically increases the odds that this becomes genuine, lasting change, rather than a private intention that quietly dissolves once nobody else is aware it existed. Is there someone trusted you could tell right now about your specific commitment, asking them to genuinely check in with you later? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because more of these truths are waiting for whenever your next chapter needs this kind of accountability. Why setbacks don't mean this momentum has been lost. Here's something important worth understanding. As you move forward, you will likely have moments, maybe even entire days, where you slip back into old patterns despite genuine commitment. That doesn't mean this momentum has been lost or that your original decision wasn't real. It simply means change is rarely a clean, uninterrupted line. What matters is returning to the commitment each time you notice you've drifted, rather than abandoning it entirely the first time you stumble. Can you commit to returning to this momentum even after an inevitable setback, rather than treating one stumble as proof the whole effort failed? Why celebrating small progress actually sustains motivation longer than waiting for the final result. Here's something worth practicing intentionally. Actually pause and acknowledge small progress along the way, rather than only planning to celebrate once the entire goal is finally achieved. Waiting until the complete result arrives before allowing yourself any genuine satisfaction often exhausts motivation long before you ever reach that distant finish line. Small, genuine celebration along the way sustains the energy needed to actually keep going. What small piece of progress could you genuinely celebrate right now, rather than waiting until the entire goal feels complete? Why your environment needs to support this momentum, not quietly undermine it. Here's something practical worth examining honestly. Look at your actual physical and social environment and ask whether it's genuinely supporting this new momentum or quietly working against it. Removing specific temptations, adjusting your daily routine, even limiting time with people who consistently discourage this change becomes part of genuinely protecting the progress you've already started building. Does your current environment genuinely support this momentum, or is something in it quietly working against the change you're trying to build? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because more of these truths are waiting for whenever your next season needs this kind of practical protection. Why this momentum, sustained consistently, eventually becomes your new normal. Here's something worth understanding as genuine encouragement. What currently requires deliberate, conscious effort, choosing the harder action, resisting old patterns, following through despite fading motivation, eventually becomes significantly easier, almost automatic, once sustained consistently long enough. You're not required to maintain this exact level of intentional effort forever. You're simply building toward a point where this new pattern becomes your genuine, natural default. Can you trust that this level of deliberate effort is temporary, eventually becoming your natural, automatic default once sustained long enough? Truth for today. Building lasting momentum from yesterday's first step requires a genuine second action today. A written, specific commitment, real accountability with someone you trust, grace for inevitable setbacks, small celebration along the way, and an environment that genuinely supports rather than undermines this change. Sustained this way, what currently feels difficult eventually becomes simply who you are. If you committed fully to sustaining this momentum using everything discussed today, what do you believe your life would look like just 30 days from now? You've learned something today that transforms yesterday's single step into genuine, sustainable momentum, that the second action matters more than the first, that written commitment and real accountability protect against quiet abandonment, and that setbacks don't erase progress as long as you keep returning to it. Stay committed. Take today's step. Let momentum build, one genuine day at a time. If this message is helping you move forward, subscribe now, because more of these truths are waiting for whenever your next chapter needs this kind of practical encouragement. The next 24 hours matter again today. Now go use them well. God says, the one conversation you've been avoiding, have it this week. In part 1, we talked about the conversation you've been carrying silently, and why waiting for a perfect moment usually just adds weight, rather than making things easier. So today, let's go further. How do you actually prepare for and approach this conversation well, so it doesn't turn into something that makes the relationship worse instead of better? Because having the conversation matters, but having it wisely matters just as much. Are you ready to learn exactly how to approach this? Here's what tends to happen. Even after someone finally commits to having a difficult conversation, they walk into it unprepared, letting years of pent-up emotions spill out all at once, turning a conversation that could have been genuinely productive into something that feels more like an ambush, leaving both people defensive and hurt rather than actually closer to resolution. Have you ever finally had a difficult conversation, only to watch it turn into something more chaotic and hurtful than you actually intended? Why starting with your own feelings works better than starting with their behavior. Here's something practical worth understanding. Conversations tend to go significantly better when you start by naming your own feelings and experience, rather than opening with an accusation about the other person's behavior. Saying, "I've been feeling distant from you and I want to understand why," lands very differently than "you never make time for me anymore." The first invites genuine dialogue, the second immediately triggers defensiveness. How could you reframe the opening of your conversation to start with your own feelings, rather than immediately naming their behavior? Why choosing the right moment matters more than you might think. Here's something worth being intentional about. While waiting for a perfect moment indefinitely is genuinely a trap, choosing a reasonably calm, private moment for this conversation still matters significantly. Bringing up something difficult in the middle of an unrelated argument, in front of other people, or when someone is already exhausted and stressed, sets the conversation up to fail before it even genuinely begins. Can you identify a reasonably calm, private moment this week where this conversation could actually be received well? Why you need to know your actual goal before you walk into this conversation. Here's something worth clarifying for yourself in advance. What do you actually want to happen as a result of this conversation? Are you seeking understanding, an apology, a specific change in behavior, or simply the relief of finally being honest? Knowing your actual goal beforehand helps you stay focused during the conversation itself, rather than getting pulled into unrelated tangents or old, unresolved arguments that derail the actual purpose. What is your actual specific goal for this conversation beyond simply finally speaking honestly? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because part 3 goes even deeper into exactly what to do once this conversation is actually finished. Why you need to prepare for a response that isn't what you're hoping for. Here's something worth preparing for. Honestly, this conversation might not go the way you're hoping it will. The other person might get defensive, might minimize what you're sharing, might respond with hurt or anger instead of the understanding you're hoping for. Preparing yourself emotionally for that possibility, rather than only imagining the ideal outcome, protects you from being completely destabilized if the actual response turns out to be more complicated. Are you emotionally prepared for a response that isn't the ideal outcome you're hoping for, rather than only imagining how you want this to go? Why listening matters as much as speaking in this exact conversation. Here's something worth remembering. As you actually enter this conversation, it's not simply about finally saying what you've been holding back. It's also about genuinely listening to their response, their perspective, their own version of events, which might include information or context you genuinely didn't have before. Approaching this as a genuine dialogue, rather than simply a monologue you've been rehearsing, gives it a far better chance of actually deepening the relationship, rather than simply venting years of frustration. Are you prepared to genuinely listen to their response, rather than simply delivering what you've been rehearsing and considering the conversation complete? Why you don't need to resolve everything in this one conversation. Here's something worth releasing before you actually begin. The pressure to fully resolve this entire situation in one single conversation. It's okay if this becomes the beginning of an ongoing dialogue rather than a single complete resolution. Saying honestly, I need some time to think about what you've shared, or can we talk about this again in a few days, is a completely legitimate way to close a conversation that's opened something significant without needing to force immediate, complete resolution. Can you release the pressure to fully resolve everything in one sitting, allowing this to become the beginning of an ongoing conversation instead? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because part 3 continues exploring exactly what happens after this conversation, however it actually unfolds. Why having this conversation well matters more than having it perfectly. Here's something worth understanding. As you actually approach this conversation doesn't need to be flawless in order to be genuinely valuable. You might stumble over your words, get emotional, forget something you meant to say. What matters is that you approached it with genuine honesty, reasonable preparation, and openness to actually hearing their response, rather than needing every single detail to unfold exactly as you'd rehearsed it. Can you release the need for this conversation to be perfect, trusting instead that genuine, reasonably prepared honesty is enough? Truth for today. Approaching this conversation well means starting with your own feelings rather than their behavior, choosing a reasonably calm moment, knowing your actual goal beforehand, preparing for a response that might not be ideal, genuinely listening rather than only speaking, and releasing the pressure to fully resolve everything in one sitting. Prepared this way, this conversation has a genuine chance to actually deepen the relationship, rather than simply venting years of built-up frustration. If you approach this conversation with everything discussed today, how much more confident do you feel about actually having it this week? You've learned something today that transforms this conversation from something you're simply dreading into something you can actually approach wisely, starting with your feelings, choosing the right moment, knowing your goal, preparing for imperfect responses, and genuinely listening rather than only speaking. Prepare well, then have it this week, imperfectly but honestly. There's more ahead. Part 3 goes into exactly what to do after this conversation, however it actually unfolds. If this message is helping you move forward, subscribe now, because Parts continues exactly where this left off. You know how to approach it now. Go have the conversation. God says the one conversation you've been avoiding, have it this week. We talked about the conversation you've been carrying silently for far too long. In part 2, we talked about how to actually approach it well, starting with your own feelings, choosing the right moment, preparing for imperfect responses. Today, we finish this journey by answering the last question. Whatever happens in that conversation, however it actually unfolds, what do you do afterward? How do you carry the outcome, good or difficult, in a way that genuinely serves your peace going forward? Are you ready to close this chapter completely? Here's what tends to happen even after someone finally has this difficult conversation. Having prepared well, having spoken honestly, they're left uncertain about what to actually do with the outcome. If it went well, they wonder if the relationship is genuinely different now, or if things will simply drift back to how they were before. If it went poorly, they wonder if they made a mistake by speaking at all, second-guessing the entire decision to finally be honest. Whether your conversation goes well or poorly, have you already anticipated feeling uncertain about what to actually do with the outcome afterward? Why, having the conversation was always the right decision, regardless of the outcome. Here's something worth understanding clearly. Before we even discuss the specific outcome, choosing honesty over continued silence was always the right decision, independent of how the other person actually responded. You cannot control their reaction. You can only control whether you finally spoke your truth with genuine care and preparation. That choice, regardless of outcome, was already worth making. Can you hold on to the fact that having this conversation was the right decision, regardless of how the other person actually responded to it? Why a good response doesn't mean the relationship is instantly, permanently fixed. Here's something worth understanding. If this conversation actually went well, a positive, understanding response doesn't mean every underlying issue has been instantly and permanently resolved. It means a genuine door has opened, a foundation for continued honesty has been established. The relationship still requires ongoing effort, follow-through, and continued communication to actually build on what this conversation started. If your conversation went well, are you prepared to keep building on it with ongoing effort, rather than assuming everything is now automatically fixed? Why a difficult response doesn't mean you made the wrong decision to speak. Here's something worth understanding. If this conversation didn't go the way you hoped, a defensive, hurt, or dismissive response from the other person doesn't mean you made a mistake by finally being honest. It simply reveals where they currently are in their own capacity to receive difficult truth, information that's valuable for you to have, even though it's genuinely painful to receive. If your conversation was difficult, can you separate the validity of your decision to speak from the difficulty of their specific response? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because more of these truths are waiting for whenever your next difficult conversation needs this kind of grounded wisdom. Why you might need to revisit this conversation again, and that's genuinely okay. Here's something worth accepting honestly. One conversation, however well prepared and honestly delivered, doesn't always fully resolve something that's been building for years. You might need to revisit this topic again in a follow-up conversation once both of you have had time to process what was initially shared. That need for continuation doesn't mean the first conversation failed. It simply means genuine resolution sometimes requires more than a single exchange. Are you prepared to revisit this conversation again if needed, rather than expecting one exchange to resolve everything permanently? Why your own peace, protected now, matters more than their final response. Here's something worth centering as this journey nears its close. Regardless of how this specific conversation ultimately settles, your own genuine peace, protected through the simple act of finally speaking honestly, instead of continuing to carry unspoken weight, matters more than whether their response matched exactly what you were hoping for. You've already accomplished the most important part, releasing yourself from carrying this silently any longer. Can you feel some genuine relief already, simply from having finally spoken, regardless of exactly how their response ultimately unfolds? If this reflection is meaningful to you, that's exactly why this series was written. Subscribe now, because there's more waiting for whenever your next chapter needs this kind of grounded peace. Why this experience makes your next difficult conversation easier to actually have. Here's something worth recognizing as genuinely valuable, regardless of this specific outcome. Having walked through the process of preparing for and actually having a genuinely difficult conversation, You've built real, lived experience that makes your next difficult conversation, whenever it eventually arrives, significantly easier to approach. You now know you're capable of this. That capability doesn't disappear once this specific situation resolves. How has this experience built genuine confidence that will make your next difficult conversation easier to actually have? Why your willingness to have this conversation becomes something someone else might need to witness. Here's something worth carrying forward as this entire journey concludes. Your willingness to finally speak honestly after months or years of avoidance might become quiet encouragement for someone else in your life who's currently avoiding their own difficult conversation. Watching you model that honesty is genuinely survivable, even when it's difficult, even when the outcome isn't perfectly guaranteed. Who in your life might be encouraged simply by witnessing your willingness to finally have this difficult conversation? The final truth. Whatever happened in this conversation, whether it opened a genuine door toward deeper connection or revealed a harder truth about where this relationship currently stands, choosing honesty over continued silence was always the right decision. Your peace, protected through finally speaking, matters more than any single response. And this experience has genuinely built your capacity for whatever difficult conversation comes next in your life. If you carried this same willingness to speak honestly into every future difficult conversation, how differently might your relationships unfold over the years ahead? Series finale. You've walked through this entire journey, from carrying an unspoken conversation silently for far too long, through learning how to actually approach it well, to finally understanding how to carry whatever outcome unfolds with genuine peace and continued growth. You had the conversation that already mattered, regardless of exactly how it unfolded. If this series meant something real to you, don't let it end here. Subscribe now, because there's always another message waiting for exactly the moment you need it most. And this channel isn't finished showing up for you yet. You spoke honestly. That took genuine courage. Now go carry that courage forward.